Welcome to this celebration of Peter's life. My name's Piers, Handling Director and CEO of TIFF, a lifelong friend of Peter. I can't see everyone out there, but I've seen many of Peter's friends who are going to be speaking today. We're going to do an open mic at the end if we have some time. So those of you who knew Peter really well will have an opportunity to remember him as well. Peter touched many of you in the room directly. Whether it's a student, some of us as students, some of us as colleagues, fellow professors, colleagues, workers, etc., etc. As mentors, he was also a wonderful mentor. And those of you who didn't know him well, I think indirectly he will touch you, because this building, I hope, embodies Peter's spirit in many ways. And many of the people who actually worked on this building, Michelle and myself, I think carried Peter's spirit into this building in all kinds of ways. And Wayne Clarkson and Helga Stephenson, former directors of the film festival, also knew Peter very, very well. Peter was an early programmer here at the festival, affected this institution when it was called the Festival of Festivals. And Peter's love of cinema, I hope is embodied in our Cinematheque. Peter's love of Canadian cinema, I hope, is embodied in absolutely everything we do here as an institution. So indirectly, because he had and cast such an enormous shadow, enormous influence over so many of us, I always feel Peter's spirit when I come into this building on a daily basis. And so many of the films that we put on screen are the films that Peter actually introduced me to. So the format of today's event is going to be basically speakers and clips. So this is kind of a celebration, not just of Peter, but also of many of the films that he absolutely loved. I'd like to acknowledge, welcome, and thank some of the guests who've joined us this afternoon. Elizabeth Harcourt, Peter's sister. Laura Ferguson, Peter's niece, and her partner Roger. Anne Howe, Peter's niece, and her partner Keith. So some members of the family are here, and a huge welcome to them. Peter's dear friend Mish Kohler, with Rebecca Kohler and Yves Guignon. Peter's dear friend Michael Ostroff. TIFF founder Bill Marshall. Filmmaker Don Shabib. And fellow scholars and friends, Kathy Elder, Anne McKenzie, Angela Stukator, Geraldine Sherman, Robert Fulford, Surinder Dalawal, Jean-Marc Larivière, Cass Banning, James Quant, Blaine Allen. And there's a many who send their regrets, but are here obviously with us in spirit. And they include Peter's son, John Harcourt, who sent along Peter's Order of Canada, which is displayed here on stage. And please notice this kind of little, I don't know what it is. It's sort of, this is the little shrine, exactly. This sort of looks a bit like Peter's living room. When many of us went and of course drank with Peter and talked cinema and life, that's what it looked like. His former wife, Joan Harcourt, sadly could not make it here today as well. And some of his friends, Susanna Pick, Christine Ramsey, and Colleen Murphy, all sent their regrets. Before we start, I'd like to thank a couple of people who pulled this event together. Keith Benny from TIFF's Adult Learning Department. He did a phenomenal job in terms of clip selection and dealing with all the guests, as well as my assistant, Santiago Rodrigo Hilara. Now, our first speaker this afternoon is Robert Fothergill. I'll probably just end up calling him Bob. He's a professor at the Department of Theatre at York University, playwright, critic, and theatre historian. He was one of the founders of the Canadian Filmmakers Distribution Centre and wrote extensively on Canadian cinema in the 1970s. A key article he wrote that influenced many of us, Coward, Bully, and Clown. His award-winning plays include Detaining Mr. Trotsky, Public Lies, Borderline, and the Dershowitz Protocol. He was a very, very close friend of Peter's, literally going back to the 60s, early 70s. Now, please welcome Bob Fothergill, who will introduce his clip.
I'm sure we're all thinking what a shame it is Peter couldn't be here, because he'd love to hear us all talking about him. I want to speak briefly about our friend in the light of his lifelong preoccupation with the films of Jean-Luc Godard, which goes right back to the chapter he wrote for his book, 6 European Directors. My copy is falling apart and has to be held together with an elastic band. Up to quite recently, I'm sure in the latest times I visited Peter, he was still saying, I've got to write another thing about Godard. And it peaked, of course, in the huge retrospective that he did of Godard's work for the Festival of Festivals in, I think, 1980, which, by his own account, nearly did him in. He talks about that heroic labor in his memoir, A Canadian Journey. I'm going to more or less read because we're on a very tight timeline, and if I start improvising, I will go over. In the early 1960s, European film seemed to many of us, if I can say that, to be exploring in dramatic but also in philosophical terms, with all that talk that European films had, some pretty central issues about what I might dare to call the meaning of life. And I think we went to those movies. I'm thinking of the film club at university in about 1959-60. Went to those movies hoping for something in the way of a revelation, to get tentative answers to questions about how to live, about freedom and the meaning of our existence. Existentialist questions, in a word. About the nature of individual identity. Who am I? To what extent am I a free, autonomous, responsible determiner of my own being? And to what extent am I just a puppet of forces that are working through me? Am I defined by what I commit myself to in the real world, the political world finally, or by who and how I love? Do I really get to choose and therefore be held responsible, or do I just act out what I am and can therefore be absolved of any responsibility? I think these questions were very tantalizingly put to us in the late 50s, early 60s in the films coming especially out of Paris. And I think that Peter saw in the conflicts and contradictions in Godard's characters a reflection of his own, and that his attempt to achieve a coherent critical position vis-à-vis the films of Jean-Luc Godard was a quest for personal coherence as well. He was fascinated by characters who were drawn to reckless self-sabotage and to use a common phrase of his, l'amour fou, who feel themselves on the edge of a cliff, whether of desperation or release. He talks in his almost too self-revelatory memoir, A Canadian Journey, about jumping off cliffs, metaphorically and even in one case literally. At the same time, he's trying to write with critical rigor and precision about the formal properties of Godard's films, to give an accurate account of what actually occurs on the screen and the soundtrack, and to give a persuasive account of what we find ourselves feeling, tending, as I think he did in most of his writing, to assume that he can speak unproblematically in the name of the we who are watching the film. I've chosen to show a 90-second clip from the Godard film Vivre sa vie, featuring Anna Karina, and I would like, if I can be allowed, about 2 more minutes to read a few sentences of Peter's commentary on it, just so we have his own critical voice. Play, Vivre sa vie. Here's just a tiny bit of what Peter has to say about that particular moment. I had to copy it because the print in 6 European directors is so small. Nana's disquisition on responsibility provides us with a curious moment in the film. Again, it is a teasing moment, like the many quotations and little stories that we find throughout Godard's films. Teasing and rhetorical, because the ideas expressed in them have little organic connection to the context in which they appear. What we have seen so far of Nana as a character is the complete reverse of what we now hear. Throughout the film, we see what happens to Nana rather than what she does, the very reverse of responsibility, as most of us would understand it. This dislocation of characterization can have a double effect upon us. On the one hand, it is a part of the schizoid feeling that all of Godard's characters convey, with their double names and their uncertain path they tread between real life and fantasy comic strip roles. On the other hand, the same dislocation invites us, I think, to attribute to such a speech a certain choric force. When characters in a play speak out of character, we can assume, I believe, that they speak at least in part for the author himself. In any case, the ideas expressed, as in this moment in Vivre sa vie, gain the force of italics from the context in which they occur. More than that, as she delivers this speech in her self-absorbed way, the natural sounds in the café that are generally in Godard such a persuasive part of the naturalistic element of such a scene, these natural sounds for the moment are suppressed, thus adding emphasis to what Nana is saying, and yet, like the movements of her hands and her head, giving it a slightly artificial air. Is it as if Nana, the prostitute, doesn't really believe herself, we might wonder? Is it that Anna Karina, the actress, doesn't quite believe what Godard, at that time her husband, is telling her to say? We can never know. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Clark Mackey is associate professor in the Department of Film and Media at Queen's University. And Queen's, of course, was a huge part of Peter's life. He's worked as the director, cinematographer, editor, producer, and writer on over 50 films, television, and new media projects, including The Only Thing You Know, A Right to Live, Taking Care, and Festival Express. The Only Thing You Know was one of Peter's favorite films. He had an extraordinary connection with that film and a lifelong friendship with Clark as well. It's very appropriate that Clark is now back teaching at Queen's, the film department that Peter put in place. So now, before Clark comes to the stage, let's take a look at a clip from Don Owen's Nobody Waved Goodbye.
So apologies for the spoiler. For those of you who haven't seen Nobody Waved Goodbye. So it's well known now that Peter Kastner, while improvising the dialogue for that pivotal scene in Nobody Waved Goodbye, did not know that the other actor, Julie Biggs, was going to announce her pregnancy to him. And the smile on his face is actually of an actor being put in a situation that he wasn't prepared for. But it's part of the incredible sort of spontaneity of that film. When I saw the film Nobody Waved Goodbye for the first time in 1965, and I was 14 years old, the possibilities for a cinema freed from the studio and scripts and stars and special effects deeply excited me. And I remember leaving the theater and saying to myself, one day I want to work for the National Film Board and I want to make films like that. If you'd asked me at the time, like, what was it about the film that appealed to me, I would have said, well, it's for one thing, it's people speaking Torontonian, right? It's people going to the island, or riding on the subway, or shopping in Cole's bookstore. For those of you who are old enough to remember Cole's bookstore, and hanging out in Yorkville, right? It was about here, not someplace in Europe or America, and it was about what was happening now. Like so many of these things, and this is sort of a famous story now too. I mean, the Canadian critics dismissed Nobody Waved Goodbye as not worthy of, it was as a work of amateurs and not worthy of consideration. And it wasn't until the New York critics praised the movie that the Canadian critics revised their opinions. Not long after that, a few years after, I made my own feature film, and it was deeply affected by the vision and the process of Nobody Waved Goodbye. And when I first met Peter Harcourt in 1975, our mutual love of quiet, thoughtful, and decidedly un-Hollywood Canadian films was the first thing that we talked about. And it was a liberation for me to actually meet someone who could articulate so well why those films were important for us, for Canadians, but also for the world and their place in the history of world cinema. So Peter was a brilliant and original public intellectual, but he also had a big, big heart. He was a lover. And not just of women, although he loved you very much, but a lover of men, a lover of art making, and a lover of idea making of all kinds. So over the decades, Peter and I had many long, intense conversations about love, politics, and art, not necessarily in that order. We sometimes disagreed. Those conversations, difficult as they sometimes felt at the time, inspired me to take big risks, to have a family, to make adventurous films, to teach at a university, to write a book. This was Peter's great gift. Peter was precise and critical. He didn't suffer fools, but he would look you in the eye and say, that marginal practice you're attempting, that original idea you're broaching, these things really do matter to people right now in the world. Keep doing them. Refuse the censorship of fad and convention. What an amazing gift that was. So today I work at following Peter Harcourt's example in the classroom, in life, in art. I try to encourage others to take meaningful risks. And I often find myself asking, well, what would Peter say? Or what would Peter do? And usually the answer I get flies in the face of conventional wisdom. And it's very hard not to be able anymore to look him in the eye and ask him. Thank you.
Brenda Longfellow is Associate Professor of Film Studies and Director of Graduate Programs in Cinema and Media Studies at York University. She's an award-winning filmmaker, writer, and film theorist. Her productions include Our Marilyn, Gerda, Shadowmaker, Gwendolyn McEwen, Poet, and Tina in Mexico. And Brenda has published numerous articles on feminist film theory and Canadian cinema. She was a part of the Ottawa Mafia that I was a part of in the 70s. We all kind of met at that point in time. Brenda and I met as a part of the Canadian Film Group and, of course, have kept in touch. So now, please, let's take a look from Micheline Langto, also a very close friend of Peter. Peter and Micheline Langto connected. I think they were on a Canada Council jury together, and they just fell in love with each other and kept in contact for Micheline's entire career. And Peter was a huge fan of her work. So please, let's now show a clip from Micheline Langto's De Actrice.
So I hope everyone got the French. I couldn't find a subtitled version. It's fairly simple. One of the women is declaring she's a sister, and the other one says, I don't have a sister. So the clip you just saw, and it was really important for me that you saw the opening title, that Deux Actrices was produced with the Canada Council grant and the support of LACPAV, a film and video cooperative in Montreal. It's a low-budget film, a personal film, a film that creates its drama through the encounter between two sisters with a formal twist. An art film en français set in Montreal. The kind of film, in other words, that Peter, the great Anglophone Francophile, championed throughout his career. When Kay Armitage, Cass Banning, Janine Marchessault, and I were developing Gendering the Nation, which was the first anthology on women's cinema in Canada, we were unanimous that we would invite our friend and mentor to contribute an essay. And thus Peter became a member of a very select group. Of the 18 essays in the anthology, only 4 are written by men, and I believe Peter's was the only original essay. In that anthology, Peter chose to write about 2 films by Micheline Langto, who heard a great friend of Peter. Sonatine, produced in 1984, and Deux Actrices. He begins in his essay by warning us that while they appear, quote, innocent, they are far more theoretical than they appear. Of course, Peter is using theory here in a way which is uniquely his own. Well, he quotes Donna Haraway, Judith Butler, Kasia Silverman, even going so far as to suggest that Sonatine might, quote, lend itself to an inverted Lacanian analysis. He is less interested in rationalizing the film through the mechanical imposition of theoretical abstractions than in thinking through how formal expressiveness, we could call this style, might be considered as revelatory of complex truths and the nurturing possibilities of a deeper engagement with the world. This critical stance, of course, was forged through Peter's Cambridge years, and his training in the art of analysis by the great literary critic F.R. Leavis. In fact, Leavis's central criterion for great literature, that it has, quote, a vital capacity for experience, a kind of reverent openness before life, and a marked moral intensity, seems to me to also characterize the persistent quality of films that were in the Harcourt canon. In the essay he wrote for us, Peter reads the formal innovation in sonatine as deeply indebted to musical form. Sonatine, he writes, is an exercise in rhythm and movement. Of course, it's no surprise that Peter, former jazz trumpeter, undergraduate music major at U of T, Glenn Gould aficionado, would gravitate towards this property of musicality. It's the film's abstraction and the way in which it subsumes the political within the aesthetic, that's a quote from him, that deeply impresses him. He gives us a sense of his own delight as spectator when he writes that we need to suspend our expectations concerning psychological and narrative plausibility. Quote, while watching Sonatine, we simply marvel at the intricacy of its formal achievement. And I love that word, marvel. Although less abstractly organized, Peter identifies the accomplishment of Deux Actrices as a work whose theoretical problematic has to do with performance. The performance of the two actors who debate their process of building a character in the video sequences, but more broadly speaking, the performance of the film itself, which oscillates between film and video, script and improvisation, undermining any stable binary as the faux documentary bleeds into fiction and as the two women characters ultimately exchange identities. Peter does not want to engage with the gendered implications of this doubling, although one could imagine a feminist reading of that. Instead, he reads the film as operating on the level of what he calls an irresolvable irony, where there are no simple truths, and where the ending of the film remains ambiguous and unsettling. Peter didn't write a lot about women's cinema, and that, I think, wasn't because he was an unrepentant patriarch. If anything, he was a deeply repentant and, well, lovable patriarch. But because his film essays are so intensely personal, so bound up with a critic's struggle to understand the world as Godard, Lefebvre, Renoir, Fellini, MacGillivray, Ostroff, etc., imagined it that transference was blocked on the shoals of gender. I suspect he also felt that feminist film theory was too bound to the critical orthodoxies he encountered when he returned to London in 1979, and so-called screen theory was all the rage. In his autobiography, which Rob has mentioned, Peter wrote about the reign of terror inflicted by screen theory that for him deserved opprobrium because it was launching an attack on humanism, and because he felt that the effort to turn the art of analysis into a science was profoundly misguided. And of course, he was right. 2 decades later, screen theory had certainly run its course. Peter moved on too, and in his later writing grappled with work that went well beyond the humanist canon of white male directors, as witnessed by his essay on Clement Virgo's Rude, and by his wonderfully hortative essay in Cine Action, Diversity or Dumb Realism, which begins with his assertion, unquestionably, the challenge of contemporary civilization is the challenge of diversity. The latter essay, ostensibly a review of the Perspective Canada program at Festival of Festivals, as TIFF was then called, is actually a poignant lament on the state of Canadian cinema, which at the turn of the millennium, Peter sees as having succumbed to commercialism and what he calls dumb realism. But these latter two are really synecdoches for a deeper lament around the massive homogenizing impulse of globalization and the corporatization of the world. Among the detritus at the festival, at least Peter called it detritus, Peter discovers, however, a ray of hope. Richard Fung's video, In the Sea of Blood, which he argues, quote, was the most inventive, the most intimate, and the most accomplished film in the entire festival. In that lament, we hear echoes of George Grant, of Harold Innis, of Charles Taylor, of Bruce Elder, of the Canadian intellectual tradition that had so nourished Peter. For those thinkers, as for Peter, culture had a moral vocation precisely as a ray of hope against the monolithic and imperial culture of the marketplace. So I'd like to end my remarks with the exhortation that concludes that essay. Down with commercial cinema. Long live the experimental tradition. The works of this tradition are the monarch butterflies of cultural ecology. May they be nurtured and preserved. Thank you.
Jeff Paver is a writer, broadcaster, and pop culture commentator, former host of CBC Radio's primetime program, and the co-author of Mondo Canuck, a Canadian pop culture odyssey. Former film critic for the Toronto Star, Jeff now writes a movie column, The Film Geek, for the Globe and Mail. Jeff was a student of Peter's at Carleton. Jeff and I knew each other in Ottawa, very close friends with Michelle Mayhew as well, and Jeff is, I think, proudly a part of the Ottawa Mafia. Went on to join the Canadian Film Institute before he ventured down to Toronto. Kept in touch with Peter through all of his life, right through to the very end. Jeff. Let's take a clip. Let's take a look at the clip that Jeff has chosen from Roman Kreuter and Colin Lowe Universe. Oh, I'm sorry. I've mixed this up, haven't I? This is My Darling Clementine.
On pages 37 and 38 of Movies and Mythologies, Peter Harcourt did something rather uncharacteristic of his customary writing and critical practice. He lingered over a single scene from a Western. The Western was John Ford's My Darling Clementine, and in the scene, the entire movie pauses to observe the consecration of a church in the desert. On the surface of things, everything in the movie suspends itself for the duration of this particular moment. The generic insistence on propulsive drama, the promise of righteous violence, the playing out of rituals based in gunplay and iconographic masculinity, all of this halts for a moment in what Peter might have called a grace note. Here is what Peter wrote of the scene. This long walk towards the consecration ceremony is one of the peak moments of John Ford's career. Though it may be hard to swallow now without a smile of superiority, it represents the height of Ford's belief in the achievement of the American nation. Flags are waving in the background. Music is playing. The bell is ringing from what is only the scaffolding from a tower for this church, and the entire community has come together for this very important civilizing ceremony, the consecration of a church. Peter loved this scene from My Darling Clementine for what it revealed of the mythological optimism and the idealism of the Western form, the creation of community and belonging even in the desert, of the transcendent power of the human drive for purpose and belonging no matter what the obstacles might be, of the simple power of the idea of something like home. In a way, Peter sought to build a home. And in the book, Movies and Mythologies, he was laying the foundation for his great project, building a home and an identity for Canadian cinema in the commercial wilderness frontier of the Hollywood empire in his own country. But he knew that there was more to it than the flying of flags, the ringing of bells, and the invitation to a dance, even though he always understood that nothing would draw people to enter this new home like the promise of joy and laughter. If you wanted people to come inside, you had better make them feel happy and welcome. Now, to do that, you needed more than music and scotch, although Peter always had an abundance of both of those on hand. You needed a sense of community, of a shared higher purpose and a goal, of something that circumvented all individual differences and replaced them with a sense of common good. And for Peter, that common good was a Canadian cinema that stood proudly, if imperfectly, in this desert, that asserted its identity and its right to exist, and that welcomed people regardless of their specific practice or inclinations under its roof who might have previously felt stranded in that unforgiving wilderness. If you shared the dream, you were welcome inside. The roof might leak, there might be breezes intruding, but the foundation could be solid. And if you wonder about the success or legacy of this project, if Peter Harcourt's dream of creating a home and community out of the random and raw materials of Canadian film was simply an idealist's dream or whimsy, a mythology perhaps of his own making, I'd ask you to look around you at the people who are gathered in here today. As disparate and unlikely a community of folk as you'll probably find anywhere. Teachers, filmmakers, recovering cultural bureaucrats, scarred and limping cultural nationalists, even people who just like to drop in for a laugh. I would argue that one of the reasons why Peter loved this particular scene from My Darling Clementine so intensely was because it depicted the building of a home in a desert and the promise of a community that would be sheltered beneath its roof. And I would also argue that we are gathered here today under the roof that Peter Harcourt built. Let the dancing begin. Thank you.
Peter Raymont is a filmmaker, journalist, and writer, having produced and directed over 100 documentary films. His career began at the National Film Board of Canada. He now lives in Toronto and runs White Pine Pictures. His directing credits include A Promise to the Dead, The Exile Journey of Ariel Dorfman, and Genius Within, The Inner Life of Glenn Gould. Peter was at Queen's basically the same time I was, which is where we both met Peter. Peter went to Peter for all of his films and showed many of his rough cuts. So please now join me in welcoming Peter Raymont.
Thank you, Piers. Of course, if Peter was here, he wouldn't stand behind this lectern. He'd sit on the edge of the stage and entertain you in that way. It's a great honor for me to be invited to speak about Peter, my mentor and my friend, and almost my father in a way, my film father. I kept in touch with him, as Piers said, regularly throughout my life, and was there close to the end with the Doers and with Robert Fothergill and Piers and John Harcourt and Clark and Jeff. I'm not a scholar, so I'm afraid I won't have anything very profound to say, but I'll just talk from the heart about my friend Peter and what he brought to me. I'm also honored to be presenting one of only two documentaries, clips from documentaries that you're going to see here this afternoon. Although Universe, the other one, Bruce might disagree with me, is really more of an animation film than a documentary. Lonely Boy was co-directed and shot by my other film father, Wolf Koenig, who passed away just 8 days before Peter did this past summer, and also co-directed by Roman Kreuter, who slipped away 2 years previous. I met Peter, as Piers indicated, in 1968 when I was just starting at Queen's, and Peter was just starting the Queen's Film Studies Department, the first film studies department in the country, I believe. Peter loved documentaries and screened many of them for us at Queen's as students. The early Russian films, especially by Eisenstein, the Grierson and Flaherty films, of course, Drifters, Night Mail, Nanook of the North, Industrial Britain, the French documentaries from the New Wave, especially I remember Chronique d'un été by Jean Rouche, which was shot by Canadian Michel Brault from the Film Board. The American documentaries of that period by Robert Drew and Ricky Leacock and the Maysles brothers, Primary, Crisis, Salesman, Gimme Shelter, and Fred Wiseman's great documentaries, of course, High School, Titicut Follies. But mostly, Peter loved showing us the Unit B films of the National Film Board of Canada, and especially the films from the Candid Eye series, which was a series of 13 half-hour films for television, really. And they were inspired by the work of Cartier-Bresson, the great photojournalist, photographer. It was about spontaneity and truth-telling. Unit B was led by Tom Daly, Colin Lowe, Wolf Koenig, and Roman Kreuter. They were observational films, fly on the wall, we call them now, cinéma vérité. There were no scripts. It frustrates me when broadcasters now ask me for my script for my documentary. And how can you write a script for an observational film? Peter was friends with the great cameraman that worked in Unit B, Terry Filgate, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today. He's in Italy. Terry had shot several of these films. They made 4 Unit B films in 1958, another 4 in 1959. They were really making these films. Days Before Christmas, Police, there's a whole list of these wonderful films. Peter first saw Lonely Boy, I was just told, or reminded really, before we came out here at the BFI in London in 1962, shortly after it was made, along with a lot of other of these NFB Unit B films. The Lonely Boy was the last of those 13 Candid Eye films that was shot in 1962 in Atlantic City and in Las Vegas. I'm going to show you one of my favorite clips from that film. It's very hard to choose one clip from Lonely Boy. And there's another one I'll mention later that was a close runner-up. Look carefully in the mirror, and you may see Wolf, the cameraman, shooting this clip. Here we go, Paul Anka and Lonely Boy. I'm just a lonely boy, lonely and blue. Great humor, of course, and it almost feels like one shot, although there's those cutaways to the camera, to the stills photographer. This was the best film of the year in 1963, according to the Canadian Academy of Film, and it had a special mention at the Cannes Film Festival. And Lonely Boy had a huge influence on Peter Watkins when he made his film Privilege, where he shot a scene with actors that was almost identical to the scene that I didn't choose, where Anka's giving a gift to Uncle Julie at the Copacabana in Vegas, the owner of the Copacabana. I chose Lonely Boy to show you partly because of it has a lot of subtext, and Peter loved subtext. It works on many levels. Wolf and Raymont said to Peter that the film was about a tragedy, that they saw Paul Anka as a tragic figure, someone kind of consumed by the celebrity culture. So you can watch the film on all sorts of levels. These films, these Unit B films, were really made possible, of course, by the invention of handheld cameras and crystal sync Niagara recorders. They adapted an Auricon, they used the Eclair, and the French and the Americans have gotten a lot of credit for inventing these cameras and redesigning these cameras, but the credit really belongs at the National Film Board of Canada and people like Wolf. Terry Filgate went on to shoot Primary with Drew and Pennebaker and the boys. Michel Brault, as I said, went over and shot with Jean Rouch in France, but they started in the late 50s at Unit B at the NFB. Huge influence on me was Terry Filgate, who Peter Harcourt was very good friends with and invited to Queens one day, and we went off and shot this film about the Miles for Millions walk, and I was one of the students. I guess I was 19 or 20, and I had the privilege of being Terry Filgate's sound man. And boy, I learned so much in those few hours running around after a man who must have been 20 or 30 years older than me, just trying to keep up with the guy as he shot handheld the Miles for Millions walk. Peter Harcourt and watching Lonely Boy and those other Unit B films inspired me to become a documentary filmmaker, and I was really lucky to get into the National Film Board and become friends with Wolf Koenig and Roman Kreuter and those guys that had made those wonderful films. No scripts, handheld, no tripod, natural sound. I really loved Peter Harcourt. I see him sitting there at the chair with his scotch. He was such an optimist. He was such a supportive friend to me. I would send him my rough cuts. He'd send him my notes. And we'd visit him as often as possible in Ottawa and have lunch. So thank you, Peter, for everything you've done for me and so many other filmmakers. Thanks for having me, Piers.
Bruce Elder is Director of Graduate Studies in Communications and Culture at Ryerson University. Bruce is also a filmmaker and critic, internationally recognized for his avant-garde films and his writing on film, Canadian philosophy, and computer technology. His credits include films like Lamentations, The Art of Worldly Wisdom, and Consolations, Love is an Art of Time. He's also the recipient of the Governor General's Award in Visual and Media Arts. In Peter's memoir, Canadian Journey, he describes that his friendship with Bruce has been intellectually the most challenging that I have ever had in my life. Now let's take a look at a clip from Universe by Roman Kreuter and Colin Lowe.
In his beautifully written autobiography, A Canadian Journey, Conversations with Time, Harcourt recounts the circumstances under which he came to understand that some Canadian films spoke to him in a special way. He had moved to England to study at Cambridge University at Cambridge, studying with F.R. Leavis, he encountered a powerful example of commitment to the value of serious art. He writes, everything Leavis did had an enormous moral conviction. I guess that is what made him dangerous in the eyes of the establishment. Like Socrates, he was feared as a corrupter of youth, as someone who, like George Grant in this country, felt that the world was going in the wrong direction, and that it was the role of education, in Leavis's case, supremely the study of literature, to maintain the values of a fine seriousness that were slipping away. Hence his literary preferences, his valuation of Jane Austen over Henry Fielding, of George Eliot over Charles Dickens, of D.H. Lawrence over James Joyce. After taking his master's degree, Harcourt moved to London, enrolling as a part-time doctoral candidate at Birkbeck College and teaching foreign students English. In London, he discovered the National Film Theatre, tucked under the Waterloo Bridge. It was there he first became aware of cinema as an art. He was employed in teaching so-called day-release students, young people employed in trades, but continuing to attend school a day a week until they turned 16 or met the requirements of apprenticeship. This led to his working for the British Film Institute, whose importance in opening up questions about film's place in education and generally in visual education needs to be stressed. He recounts, while I was still at the BFI, one of my jobs had been to supervise the certification of educational films. If foreign films were deemed educational, they were imported without tax. I came to see films like the National Film Board, by the National Film Board, nostalgic films like Chorale and City of Gold, philosophical films like Universe and The Living Machine, incisive, direct cinema films like I Was a 90-Pound Weakling, The Days Before Christmas, The Back-Breaking Leaf, and The Fabulous Lonely Boy, a film about the early success of Paul Anka. These films really excited me. Having been in England for over 10 years, I became accustomed to thinking of myself as a North American. But looking at them, I said to myself, these aren't American films. They're not British films. They must be Canadian films. From this aspect of self-recognition that the films provided, I wanted to return home. What these films possessed was a sense of detachment, a reflective tone. They inquired into the meaning of life while exposing its absurdities. They were the product of a sensibility that looked at our world without being part of it. Peter was astute in noting that Canadian documentary films embody a sense of detachment, looking at the world without being part of it. I have commented that these works often pose a problematic that the evidence provided by a photographically based medium, a medium that seemingly can do no more than scan the surfaces of reality, cannot adequately resolve. Questions like, what is man that a machine is not? Or even Warren McCulloch's, what is a man that he can know a number? And what is a number that it can be known by man? All from the thinking scene. Or, what is the past of the universe? The wager of my writing on Canadian documentary film was that observation, as distinct from participation, was what made for the radical difference between Canadian and American direct cinema. Peter writes about sitting his examinations at the end of his first year of Cambridge. The exercises in practical criticism, he notes, involved being handed, quote, a sheet of unsigned bits of prose or poems that we had to compare and contrast, to evaluate as best we could, to date as closely as possible, and to assign an author if we dared. It was a great exercise for drawing attention to the expressive details of style and to the shifting literary conventions of different historical eras, close quote. The end of his first year exam, he tells us, offered an Elizabethan sonnet that was, quote, mechanically rhetorical and easy to dismiss as second-rate, and quote, unquote, and a fairly contemporary lyrical poem. He confesses that he couldn't identify the author of the sonnet, but he was convinced that it was second-rate. The lyrical poem, by contrast, was magnificent, quote, one of the most perfect poems in the English language, unquote, so striking that he could, and he found it so striking that he could still quote it from memory when he wrote the Canadian Journey. It turns out that the second-rate poem was by Shakespeare and the near contemporary poem by Thomas Harding. The poem by Hardy, it turns out, resembles Unit B films in its sense of confronting mysteries that beggar understanding. This epistemological sense of the mind stretched to the end of its tether and contemplating mysteries that stretch away into the beyond, where they cannot be pursued by intelligence, is fundamental to Harcourt's understanding of the serious, that is, humane and moral art, with its self-reflexive testing and exposing of the limits of language and artistic form. It is also the source of his belief that Canadian art and film figure prominently in the history of serious art's constitution with the destitution of the modern, which so often turns its back to mystery. However, the tale is recounted in A Canadian Journey for another reason. He states that what he learned from this experience with the Hardy poem states what he learned from the experience with the Hardy poem and how it prepared for his advocacy of Canadian cinema. Quote, one must always be vigilant lest one's cultural assumptions get in the way of one's critical judgment. When I found myself waging war against the increasingly dominant fashion of French film theory, I took solace from that important Cantabrigian event. A Canadian Journey offers at least a partial explanation for the radical constriction of understanding, that it is, in his view, a social problematic. Toward the end of A Canadian Journey, Harcourt makes it explicit that the principle of his writing is the destitution of modernity, which has left us collapsed into inadequate and shrunken selves. He says, it is this inability to function as a full human subject that most insistently speaks to me. It is as much cultural as personal. We live now in a world of an increasing spiritual emptiness. Although not without excitements, the entertainment culture of the United States is the most trivializing the world has ever seen. Far more damaging than the atrocities of Adolf Hitler are the achievements of Walt Disney. He has altered the sensibilities of an entire world with its consent. The inescapable cuteness of all entertainment for children now seems without redress. Brought up within the falsification of the Disneyan imagination, you are denied access to the mysteries of the world. They are held within what Tim Finley has called a culture of commercialized immaturity. Especially in North America, Disney think exists unchallenged. Of course, we can't be but stunned by Peter's passing, leaving us here in a world that is unquestionably a bit emptied. The poet who penned the poem that Peter characterized as one of the most perfect in the English language, Thomas Hardy to be sure, gives shape to this hollow feeling in another poem, Exeunt Omnes. Everybody else then going, and I still left where the fair was. Much have I seen of neighbor loungers making a lusty showing, each now past all knowing. There is an air of blankness in the street and the littered spaces. Thoroughfare, steeple, bridge, and highway wizen themselves to lankness. Kennels dribble dankness. Folk all fade and wither as I wait alone where the fair was, into the clammy and numbing night fog whence they entered. Soon one more goes thither. Thank you.
Peter Pearson is a film and television director and screenwriter, and that probably doesn't encompass everything he does at all. His best-known credits are films like Best Damn Fiddler from Calabogie to Caladar, Paperback Hero, and a couple of wonderful films he did for the CBC, The Insurance Man from Ingersoll and The Tar Sands. Former director or president of the Directors Guild of Canada, founding member and chair of the Council of Canadian Filmmakers, and executive director of Telefilm Canada for a number of years in the 1980s. Again, wonderful friend of Peter's, and terrific story that maybe Peter will tell, which I probably shouldn't tell, but that goes back to Best Damn Fiddler. So maybe this is a part of Peter's comments. But now, please welcome Peter Pearson, who will introduce his clip.
Look, I don't deserve to be here. This is too rarefied an atmosphere for me. All I've got is some jokes and funny material. Oh, this is troubling. Oh, dear. I'll tell you, I have a Dave Letterman top 10 list for you. And here's the category. And please, I mean, if you disagree, keep it down, okay? I mean, booing and all that kind of stuff. The category is the top 10 reasons why Peter Pearson is but a figment of Peter Harcourt's imagination. And I don't really have 10 points, but if you give me enough time, maybe I could go up. So here's number 2. Piers alluded to it. But what happened was in summer of 1968, I was thrown out of the film board unceremoniously, with people kind of putting me out with the trash, which was an experience I'd already lived on This Hour of 7 Days, where I was also put out with the trash. And it was like, where's my future in all this? Is Shabib really in the room? Shabib runs along beside me. We were born within a couple of months of each other, and we were often put out with the trash. Anyhow, I thought out of no particular reason, I entered Best Damn Fiddler and Saul Alinsky Went to War into the 1969 Canadian Film Awards with no hope whatsoever. I mean, I in fact didn't even have the right to enter them. They belonged to the film board. But anyhow, what happened that night, and Shabib was there, was that we swept the film awards. We won Best Picture, Best TV Feature, and everything else in between. Saul Alinsky won 2 awards as well. Shabib at one point, in fact, said, when the film board was so cheap, they wouldn't even pay for the nominees to come to Toronto. So I kept trooping up to the platform to pick up the awards on behalf of everybody. And Shabib was going, "No more awards, he's got enough." Peter Harcourt was on the jury of that 1969 award, and so was Peter Watkins. And what really struck me, I had thought a lot about in terms of This Hour of 7 Days, which was and to this day is the greatest massacre ever within the Canadian entertainment industry, was how Peter Harcourt, like everybody at the film board, hated Best Damn Fiddler. One of the reasons why they hated it was there was a shot of Margot Kidder taking her shirt off with the camera behind her, and for 17/24 of a second, you could see just the rim of her bridge, of her breast. And so the real issue was, is 17/24 of a second enough to arouse an audience? We debated at great length, and because I wouldn't agree to put it out, that was one of the reasons why I was thrown out of the film board. But it was like, my being thrown out was a very specific relationship to us all being thrown out of the CBC in '66 with This Hour of 7 Days, a tragedy that has still not been properly examined. I have another example for you. In 1972, I made a film called Paperback Hero. Shabib, are you really in the room? Okay. Shabib named the film. Shabib, we were cutting films side by side, and he said it was originally called Last of the Big Guns. And instead of having 17/24 of a second in Best Damn Fiddler, I had 5.5 minutes of full frontal Elizabeth Ashley nudity with chunks of Keir Delay wandering in front of the camera. I thought, if they were upset by 17/24 of a second, imagine how upset they're going to be. There are some people in this room who really took after, notably Shabib and me, for making films about losers. And so about 1974, 2 years after I made the film, Harcourt phoned me. And he said, will you come into studio? He was doing an 8-part series for ideas, for... I don't remember the name of the guy. And so we sat and talked in studio, and it was all being taped. And then the next manifestation was that it was broadcast. And then about 3 years after the fact, this is something I really should not tell, he came out with the book, Movies and Mythologies, and on the front cover was the poster for Paperback Hero, which was, to me, an enormous, gutsy move. The logic at the time was that we were losers, our films were losers, why were we alive, what kind of films were we making? And Harcourt took on the whole critical establishment. He went into examining what, in fact, was the mythology of these films, how they fit within a structure. And by that point, I shouldn't say this word, shit disturber, because I was really only president of the Directors Guild and chairman of, as Piers suggested, the Council of Canadian Filmmakers. So I was in lobbying Hugh Faulkner, David Lewis, all of the big shots, and I always took with me copies of Harcourt's book, because he was more logical than me in explaining the need for a national cinema. At one point, Hugh Faulkner said to me, I read your book over the weekend, it's great. And it was just enough of a confusion between the paperback poster, and if you look quickly enough, Peter Harcourt looks like Peter Pearson, and so I used to take credit. I said, do you mind reading my book? Which was all quite grand. I only have one other actually I've got two, but I'll do them quickly. In 1977, one more time I was in trouble for the tar sands. And the mainstream press that had adored All the President's Men, had adored having actors depicting politicians, had adored the examination of Watergate, they all came down on me with a ton of bricks. I cannot tell you, I don't think there was one figure in the current Canadian press in 1977 that gave me any support whatsoever. But two guys did, Seth Feldman at York and Peter Harcourt. And the principle behind that goes back to Peter Watkins, goes back to Ken Loach, goes back to the guys that made All the President's Men. It had been seen as a precedent over and over and over again. And only these two guys came to our defense. And so, while I'm interested in all the theories and all this Peter Harcourt stuff, he was a warrior. And I used to talk to him about, you know what, Harcourt, because I was running this Council of Canadian Filmmakers, and I said, you should be involved in it. It doesn't make any difference if all this airy-fairy theoretical stuff is involved. You got to come out to the meetings. You got to, like at one point, 8 of us sued famous players, and we won. What we didn't know was that it begot us Garth Drabinsky, but that's another story. We didn't win with the Tar Sands. The Tar Sands was and is to this day the only film banned in Canada, which is bespeaks a certain situation. Let's see. I could do a top 10 list, but Pearson, come on. I mean, you already talked too much. These are all great things. This is so funny. I should have read it. Nah. Enough is enough. I came across a John Hirsch quote when I was putting it together, where I was basically trying to argue. At one point, John Hirsch, this was on the Tar Sands, he said to me, Pearson, you don't have an inferiority complex, you're simply inferior. These institutions. Okay, here's my last point. I'm cutting as I'm going, editing on the fly. In 1983, for reasons, anyhow, I became head of what's called the Broadcast Fund. And Francis Fox kept saying, well, they haven't worked since 1974. Where are you going to get filmmakers to do all this stuff? We had $165 million to spend, and that was a multiple effect because we only put in a third, so we were spending about $500 million. Well, you know where they came from? They came from Queens. That was Wendy Crewson and Bridget Berman and Peter Raymont and Mike McMillan and Janice Platt and Seton McLean. And every now and again, when I was making notes, I was surprised. I was smiling at myself at thinking how proud Harcourt must have been that we were all, in effect, the figment of his imagination, and how much we should all appreciate that. Thank you all.
I think the producer of the Ideas series that you were referring to, Peter, was Geraldine Sherman, who's in the audience. Bill MacGillivray is a film director, screenwriter, and editor, much like Peter, whose credits include films like Stations, Life Classes, The Vacant Lot, and Understanding Bliss. Founding member of the Atlantic Filmmakers Cooperative in 1974. Also a recipient of the Governor General's Award in Visual and Media Arts. Peter loved Bill's films. I remember when Bill made his first feature, Aerial View, it was shown as part of the Canadian Film Group, the organization that Brenda and I were associated with. And it led to a lifelong relationship and friendship between Bill and Peter. Now, please welcome Bill.
Thank you, Piers, so much for doing this. And I'm not sure if I should thank you for putting me on after Peter Pearson.
You know that Peter Pearson threatened to sue me once? But as he would say, that's another story. It's true, Peter. My long conversation with Peter Harcourt began with a phone call from him. And it was to me, and it ended some 35 years later with a phone call from me to him. The first call was probably in 1979. I was living by the ocean, which I love to do, in Nova Scotia, where at the time the idea of making films as a career was certainly considered just a little bit odd. But I had made the film that Piers mentioned, Aerial View, and a half-hour documentary for the NFB, and I was itching to make my first feature. I'd sent Aerial View to the Canada Council as support material for a production grant application, and like every hopeful Canada Council applicant, I was waiting patiently for disappointing news. Then one night the phone rang, and a distant voice said, "Hello, this is Peter Harcourt calling from Ottawa." And there was a pause, during which I think I was expected to say, "The Peter Harcourt?" But I was too busy thinking, who the hell is Peter Harcourt? Peter gently admonished me right away for not knowing who he was, and then in his avuncular way said, "I wanted you to know that we are watching you." The story of the feature film I wanted to make took place, for the most part, on a train that crossed the country from west to east, creating a somewhat clumsy but visually attractive metaphor for the backwards ramblings of a troubled Canadian journalist's mind. Our plan was to film several real interviews with ordinary Canadians traveling on the train and weave them into our protagonist's personal story of self-discovery as he traveled towards his home and the film's climax in Newfoundland. Our 9-person crew, 9 people making a feature film, had a ball. Do you think we should run that clip now, please? It's shorter than I would like, but... As a little aside, I brought this film to the National Film Board looking for money as an idea, and they said, yeah, shooting a film across the country is a great idea, but very impractical. We have a studio, and we have rare screen projection, and we can have men rattle the train back and forth. The National Film Board, always ahead of its time. Station premiered at the Festival of Festivals in 1983. I suspect Peter had something to do with being on the program. He certainly had something to do with my stay in Toronto. He greeted me upon my arrival, took me under his wing, encouraged me not to take a flippant John Harkness review to heart, introduced me to all the festival bigwigs, and accompanied me to the station's premiere. Was it at the Varsity? Was it at 3 o'clock on Thursday afternoon? It doesn't matter. What did matter was that as we rounded the corner, we saw a very long lineup of festival patrons clutching their schedules, moving in an orderly fashion towards the doors of the cinema where Stations was screening. Well, I was young, a festival virgin, so you can imagine my rush of anticipation. But of course, as we entered the foyer, I watched my lineup veer sharply to the left, where it became Robert Altman's lineup. As Peter and I sat together quietly in the dark amongst the scattered members of the station's audience, he patted my hand and laughed that idiosyncratic and infectious laugh of his. Welcome to the big time, MacGillivray. Later, over a scotch or two, he began to gently but earnestly dissect the film, pointing out that stylistically, the third half was an aesthetic departure from the first two-thirds. Peter and I did not always agree, but only a fool would not listen to the man's well-considered advice. Peter took the time to comment either publicly or privately on every single film and television program we, my partner and I, Jerry, ever made since then, and I continued to listen to him. A short time before his death, my partner Terry and I were visiting Peter at his assisted living home, where, by the way, he was still a stellar bartender, and gave him a copy of our latest film, a low-budget feature called Hard Drive. Back home in Nova Scotia, we waited with bated breath for his pronouncement. Eventually, we received a very long and, I think, tortured response, outlining everything he found problematic with that work. He apologized at the end of the email for not being more positive. I called him, and we had a quick and quite amusing discussion about his take on the movie, and he intimated that he would send further notes. but then silence. Thank you.
Bridget Berman is an Academy Award-winning filmmaker who's worked as a producer, director, and writer. She met Peter. She studied English and film at Queen's University in Kingston, which is where Bridget and I got to meet. Our paths crossed many, many times. Her credits include Bix, Ain't None of Them Play Like Him Yet, and The Circle Game. And in 1986, she won the Academy Award for documentary feature for Artie Shaw, Time Is All You Got. And of course, Peter was a trumpeter, so he had lots of things to say to Bridget. Her most recent film is Hugh Hefner, Playboy activist and rebel. Please welcome Bridget Berman.
Ingmar Bergman's Wild Strawberries, which is the clip I'm going to show, I quote Peter Harcourt, deserves its place in anyone's top 10 list. Charming 78-year-old Dr. Isaac Borg drives to Lund to receive an honorary degree, and along the way he reflects on life through dreams, memories, and conversations with young people hitchhiking to Italy. The first time I met Peter Harcourt was in the halls of the English department at Queen's University. I was fresh out of high school, and he was the exact opposite of what I imagined a professor to be. No stiffness, no pomposity. He was charming, friendly, and kind, and I was bowled over by his immediate helpfulness. When he heard that I was starting my first year at Queen's, he asked what I was majoring in. I told him drama and English. He smiled that charming smile of his and said, "Before you make up your mind completely, come and audit my world cinema course." I chose Wild Strawberries because it was the first Ingmar Bergman film that Peter Harcourt taught in this course. I'd never seen a film quite like this before. I can see Peter now, sitting amongst us a little higher on the back of one of the auditorium chairs, gesturing dramatically and sharing his passion for the cinema with all of us as an evocative stream of ideas pours out of him continuously. Peter's incredible passion and perception opened mine, and I'm sure many other eyes to the extraordinary vision of Bergman, Fellini, Buñuel, Truffaut, and so many of the greats. I was only going to sit in on a couple of lectures, but after the first lecture, I was hooked. The following year, I switched from theater arts to film, a decision that changed my life. I chose this particular scene because one of my many memories of Peter is his love for conversation, good conversation, and how he loved to be surrounded by both young and old, gregarious and always bridging the generations. He was a storyteller, a philosopher, and a fierce romantic. And just like Professor Borg in the film, he loved to entertain with his stories. Peter considered this scene truly magnificent. After a fiery argument between the two young men, harmony returns with all its inherent warmth and affection and the sharing of food and wine. This is the kind of lively and thoughtful exchange that Peter also loved in real life. Just as Borg is moved to quote simple but powerful poetry, in the same way Peter would often, with the simplest but most insightful words build a powerful argument. Peter had a way of moving his students deeply, of inspiring them, and I was one of the fortunate ones he inspired into filmmaking. On the third floor of Film House stood an old Mineola, the like of which now can only be found in film museums. There was a film that had to be edited, and because he knew from my 8mm film how passionate I'd become about filmmaking, he asked me if I wanted to edit it. Peter had just offered me an incredible opportunity. How could I say no? The only problem was I'd never edited 16mm film before. So he showed me how to work the mechanics of the Mineola and to crank the 16mm hand synchronizer with the 24 frames per second wrist. Technology now as extinct as the dinosaur, but to me it was a magical revelation. From then on in, every free moment, hour, evening, weekend that I had was spent at Film House, editing one film, then another and another. Film House on Stewart Street became my real Kingston home, in spite of the ghost that some of us were certain haunted this 3-story old house. My favorite film that I edited under Peter's watchful eye was a documentary called Beeler, about the Kingston artist Andre Beeler. a film of which he was inordinately proud, which he shot and directed. Peter derived great satisfaction from influencing entire generations of filmmakers. But deep in his heart, he always also wanted to pursue his own filmmaking. Since those university days, Peter came to see some of my films. The film that touched his heart most deeply was my film about the cornetist Bix Beiderbecke. Peter loved jazz, he played the trumpet, and I had no idea when I made the documentary that I'd made a film about one of his own personal heroes with whom he strongly identified. There are not many people that come into one's life who inspire and influence one as profoundly as did Peter Harcourt. It's hard to believe that this extraordinary teacher and mentor will no longer inspire a younger generation. I'm forever grateful that he was part of my life. And thank you, Piers.
Thanks, Bridget. So many memories. I'll just close off very briefly with a few comments of my own. I met Peter when I was 18, also at Queen's, and I ran into him, as Bridget said. He was the least like a professor one could imagine. I met him at a party, and Peter had a great sense of humor, and I want to stress that. And of course, everyone who knew him knows his sense of humor. It's been referred to a little bit. And he had a great ability to tell stories against himself. I met him at a party, and he told the story. He'd just come back from the UK, and I guess about 6 months previously, he had met Paul McCartney at a party. And this was just before the release of Sgt. Pepper. And Peter said, and of course his inimitable laugh followed, he said to Paul McCartney, "And what does it feel like to be on the way down?" He was the perfect person to meet as an 18-year-old. I wasn't actually a film student. I was a history and philosophy student, but I hung around the film department, Stewart House, which Bridget referred to. And he really introduced me to Godard, Fellini, Buñuel, Bergman, all of the riches of European cinema. And Robin Wood, who was teaching there, introduced me to the joys and pleasures of American cinema, Hitchcock, Ford, and Hawks. But I just want to say a few quick things about Peter. He was an incredible, you've heard how inspiring he was to people. He really provoked so many of us to be better. To reach beyond the number of my articles, my books. I ran every single one of them by Peter, and he always said, "Run it through the typewriter one more time," which I did. And I'm sure for the filmmakers, he said, "Take another look at your film, recut it, re-examine it." He instigated. He was an incredible instigator. He was somebody who worked behind the scenes. The Canadian Film Group, the Canadian Film Institute, the festival in its early days. Peter was always there. Sometimes not so silent, but always as a silent partner, always provoking a young group of people to do certain things. He was subversive, and I think this is probably why he had problems with institutions, even though he worked within institutions. He was a professor, worked at Queen's, Carleton at York. But there was a natural part of him that was kind of an anarchist. He really did push against convention. He asked people to be brave. The films that he admired so much, Godard, etc., Bruce's films, Bill's films, were films that did things very differently. They didn't follow the ordinary vocabulary of cinema. They were not as conventional as the films we were used to seeing. Peter was somebody who constantly pushed us and critics, academics as well as filmmakers, to look to the difficult, to look to the experimental. But the thing I remember the most about him is in his writing and in his criticism, he was somebody who opened doors and didn't close them. There's some critics that I've read who really close down other interpretations. You read them and you can't imagine another interpretation of a film. Peter was exactly the opposite. He actually opened meanings for you, open doors. His writing was somewhat tentative in a way, full of the words like suggest, perhaps. And one of the things I do remember that really influenced me enormously was Peter's concentration on visual moments, not on verbal moments. His beautiful article that he wrote on Don Shabib, he talked about the visual moments in going down the road. And when you read him about Bergman, et cetera, he talks a lot about moments without dialogue. And of course, Peter's criticism, and he wrote so beautifully, was trying to write about those moments that were ultimately visual moments. Because Peter had a great sense of humor, I'm going to close this. It's a somewhat longish clip. But Peter, I'm not sure, ever wrote about the Marx Brothers. But in the conversations, the kind of conversations we had in his living room, he loved the Marx Brothers. He absolutely did. And he had a great sense of Peter's buried treasures would be an interesting list to put together, because he's been so associated with high art European cinema and, of course, Canadian cinema. But I don't think people really knew his love of comedy, his love of some B films, not all B films, but certainly comedy. So I've decided to show a clip from the Marx Brothers' Duck Soup, which I thought would send this evening off, and then if we've got time, we'll do an open mic.
My name is Kim Gravella. You don't know me here. I know Peter as a friend in Ottawa. I'm from Toronto, but I live in Ottawa now. And I got to know him as a friend because he was, I'd call it, say, had a romantic friendship with my grandmother-in-law. And it was a relationship, I'd say, that was based on a lot of dignified flirtation and a lot of red wine and that kind of deep understanding that happens between people who have such a relationship where they care for each other very much, but they respect that they spent their lives with other people. And I think I became friends with him when I mentioned to him that as a musician I had chosen being a house painter as my day job because I could listen to the CBC all day. And so we became buddies and we'd hang out. And so he would talk about his work and various things, and I just wanted to mention that he often lamented being geographically separated from many of you here, and also that he often feared that the world had moved on and that all of his work had been for naught. And I just want to say that clearly that's not the case, and I'm sure so many of you who have been influenced by him have gone on to and continue to go on to influence others who have never met him, may never know his name, but clearly you have been changed by him. So I just wanted to let you know. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kim. Now, Bill.
I was saying to Piers that Peter came here under false pretenses. I was told that he was going to bring films, but really this was something that Piers and Wayne Clarkson had brought along as saying Peter was very influential in Canadian films. And then I saw all these Godard retrospectives and exotic academia. So Peter and I had some fairly vigorous discussions from time to time. I think film is kind of three things. There's cinema, there's film, and there's movies. And I tend to be in the group that likes movies. And then I'll put up with film. Cinema is for people who write books and think about them and do articles with footnotes. But one of the things I did notice about Peter and the films that he brought was really, and he did know Canadian films, is that what he did was he understood mavericks. Peter Pearson, he may not be the world's best film director, but he's pretty good. Paperback Hero, Calabogie, Don Shabib, Going Down the Road, people like that who were all mavericks and did not get along with people who said you should make things with the requirements of the CBC or whatever the cultural authorities of the day were. And I think we all take Peter Pearson, and we can forgive him for his time at Telefilm, where we would take $200 million a year and piss it against the wall and bring back $2 million a year and repeat this every year for 20 years and say, someday we'll get this right. As they say, that's another story. But I think what Peter Harcourt did was he made this festival something for everyone, which is, I think, really important. What people who come to the film festival from around the world really appreciate is the Toronto audience, and it's basically a multicultural audience. The first years, we got thousands of people who came to see people telling stories in their own languages from France and Germany, Greece, and Latin American countries, just because there was no way they could see those stories. And I think what Peter did as well, as with the Mavericks, was insist that we tell Canadian stories. And he did that. And I think, as Piers said, this building is a testimonial to what he brought us. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here, and Peter is one of those life forces that we will all miss, but his work will absolutely continue, and I think you've heard all about that today. So thank you very much for coming.